Later, at the Sky Castle of the Tapini Kingdom, the secretary informs Lu Li and his group that the king's palace is just ahead. He escorts them to the grand doors of the palace, but stops short of entering. Apologizing, he explains that he isn't permitted to go any further and can only guide them up to this point. Lu Li, maintaining his usual politeness, thanks the secretary for his assistance. Before departing, the secretary introduces the two elves stationed at the palace entrance. These stewards, Zelfei and Zelwu, have been specially chosen to welcome the king's esteemed guests. They greet the group with exaggerated formality, their over-the-top display clearly aimed at impressing the visitors. With dramatic flair, they swing open the grand gates and invite the group inside. Taking charge, Zelwu begins explaining the layout of the palace. She mentions that the first floor is called Boyuan Hall. Zelfei elaborates, stating that this hall is primarily used for banquets, balls, and other general receptions. As the team enters, Little Chili's eyes widen in amazement at the sheer extravagance surrounding her. The walls are adorned with glittering golden ornaments and sparkling gems, making the entire hall shine with an almost blinding opulence. Ah Fei, however, isn't as impressed. Looking around at the over-the-top display, he scoffs, declaring it to be a perfect example of the absurdity of unchecked capitalism. His remark earns a smirk from Hua Jiao, though Little Chili seems too dazzled to care. Before the group can take in more of the hall's grandeur, Zelwu opens another door and informs them of the king's orders. Each team member, as decreed by the king, is granted the opportunity to select one treasure from the royal treasury. Zelfei stands proudly, almost as if expecting applause for delivering such news. The team exchanges excited glances, ready to see what treasures lie ahead. Zelfei politely invites them to proceed further, explaining that the king's treasury is hidden beneath the palace. Lu Li and his team step into what feels like an endless pit. The area is dark, with barely enough light to see a few feet ahead. A heavy silence and eerie shadows make it feel more like a dungeon than a treasury. Zelfa, ever the showman, warns them to be cautious, pointing out the long staircase ahead. He makes it sound like he's doing them a favor, but the steep, winding descent looks like a disaster waiting to happen. Little Chili takes one look at the staircase and freezes. Her face turns pale, and she grabs onto Afei's arm so tightly he nearly stumbles. Afei, clearly unimpressed with her dramatics, tells her to just close her eyes if she's so scared. His tone makes it obvious he's not exactly overflowing with empathy, but he doesn't push her away either. Little Chili clings to him like her life depends on it, muttering about how ridiculously high the staircase is. As the group begins their descent, Afei's irritation grows with every step. He looks around at the overly dramatic staircase and the endless pit below and wonders why on earth anyone would go to such lengths for a treasure vault. To him, this isn't a treasury, it's an ego project. He grumbles under his breath, complaining that the king must have gotten bored one day and decided to dig a hole just to see how far he could go. He keeps hoping that when they reach the bottom, there will actually be something worthwhile to make all this trouble feel justified. Little Chili, still holding on to Afei, keeps glancing nervously down the staircase. She mumbles about how much work it must have taken to dig this hole, and Afei, ever the cynic, responds that it was probably less work than counting the king's gold every day. Huanzhou, walking behind them, hides a small smirk that keeps her focus ahead. After what feels like forever, they finally reach the bottom. Zelfei, who seems completely unfazed by the ridiculous trek, steps forward and dramatically pushes open a massive door. The sight that greets them is enough to make even Afei pause. The room is filled with treasures, golden ornaments, sparkling gems, and rare artifacts cover every inch of the space. The faint light reflects off the treasures, making the entire room glow like something out of a fairy tale. Little Chili forgets her fear in an instant and rushes forward, her eyes wide with excitement. She looks like a kid in a candy store, practically bouncing as she stares at the piles of riches. Afei follows her, but he's less dazzled. He mutters about how the king probably sleeps on a bed made of gold just to remind himself how rich he is. Even Huajiao seems a little awestruck, though she quickly masks it with her usual calm expression. For a moment, the group is silent, taking in the sheer size and wealth of the treasury. It's clear the king didn't just want to hide his treasure, he wanted to show off how absurdly rich he is. Afei and Little Chili eagerly begin inspecting the treasure, their excitement bubbling over as they rush from one shiny item to another. They barely take a moment to think, their hands itching to grab whatever looks the most expensive. It's like watching kids in a candy store with no self-control. However, before their greed gets the better of them, Zelfa steps in to remind them of the rules. They can only take one item each. The announcement is a buzzkill, and both of them groan in disappointment, but they grudgingly return to choosing more carefully. Huajiao stands to the side, clearly uninterested in all the flashy equipment. She casually suggests that Lu Li should take her share, waving off the importance of finding something for herself. Luli doesn't hesitate to shut her idea down. He tells her there's no reason for him to take her share and points out that she's missing something vital for chasing down enemies. She needs to pick something for herself, plain and simple. His tone is firm, and Huojiao can't argue with him, though part of her seems touched by his words. For a moment, Huojiao feels like Luli has been paying more attention to her than she realized. It dawns on her that he actually cares about her weaknesses and wants to help her improve. In her head, she convinces herself that she must occupy a special place in his thoughts. Of course, she could just be reading too much into it, but the idea still makes her smile, maybe a little too smugly. As Afi and Little Chili continue to bicker over which treasure looks cooler, both stewards approach Luli with a message. They inform him that the king is waiting for him at the bottomless level of the palace and suggest he meet with the king first, then return to pick his treasure later. Without wasting a moment, Luli nods and agrees. Instead of taking the long and painfully slow staircase, Luli decides to take matters into his own hands. He jumps down, skipping all the tedious steps entirely. It's a flashy move, but practical. He lands at the bottom without a scratch, earning him a few imaginary points for style. At the bottom, he finds himself in the king's grand throne room. The king sits on his elaborate throne, exuding power and authority, clearly loving every second of his own importance. Luli walks forward with caution, keeping his composure as he addresses the king and asks why he has been summoned. The king, clearly thrilled to finally meet the famous Zhang Yu, greets Luli with a warm smile that feels just a little too smug. With a flick of his hand, he conjures another chair, inviting Luli to sit. But Luli doesn't immediately comply. Instead, he stays standing, his sharp gaze fixed on the king as he tries to figure out the true reason for this meeting. The king, noticing the hesitation, grins knowingly. He points out what Luli is probably thinking, why someone as powerful as the king would go to such lengths to meet him personally. Luli takes his seat and cuts right to the heart of the matter. If the king is so desperate to save his daughter, why didn't he send every warrior in the kingdom instead of wasting everyone's time with a flashy, unnecessary tournament? His blunt question hangs in the air, sharp and direct. The king coughs awkwardly, clearly caught off guard by Luli's boldness. He had expected strength from this warrior, but hadn't anticipated his sharp tongue. Before Luli can press further, iron clamps suddenly shoot out from the chair, locking him in place. He struggles, startled, but the restraints don't budge. Standing slowly, the king's smug grin spreads across his face as he reveals the truth. Luli's instincts were right. There was never a princess to save, no dragon to fight, and definitely no noble mission. The entire tournament had been nothing more than a charade. The king removes his cloak with dramatic flair, revealing a grotesque second face embedded in his chest. The sight is horrifying, as his body begins to swell, muscles bulging grotesquely as if his ego was not big enough already. He steps closer, radiating an ominous energy that fills the room. He finally lays out his true plan. The tournament wasn't about heroism or honor. It was a test to find the strongest physical body, the perfect vessel for his rebirth. His goal is simple and selfish: to regain his lost youth and strength by taking over the body of the most exceptional warrior. Once he has his new body, he plans to dominate the mortal world again and ensure his so-called legend reigns supreme. Luli thrashes against the chair, desperate to break free. The king mocks him with obvious delight. The king explains that the material used to bind him is the same substance as the arena stage, specifically designed to hold even the most powerful fighters. Luli's struggles are useless, and the king is quick to remind him of that. Smiling with twisted satisfaction, the king leans closer, calling Luli his ultimate prize. To him, Luli is perfect, a flawless vessel worthy of holding his power. He assures Luli that he wouldn't risk damaging something so valuable. Every detail of this trap has been planned to ensure the body he's about to claim remains completely intact. The monstrous face on the king's chest contorts grotesquely before opening its twisted mouth. From it, a stream of dark red energy erupts, latching onto Luli. The sinister energy begins draining the life from him, fueling the king's vile attempt at rebirth. Luli strains against the iron clamps, but they don't budge. He feels his strength slipping away with every passing second, leaving him weaker and more desperate. Back at the warehouse, the rest of the team seems oblivious to what's happening elsewhere. They are busy wrapping up their weapon selection. Ah-Fei is practically glowing with excitement as he admires his newly acquired snap gloves, equipped with teleportation abilities. He's wanted these for what feels like forever, and now he finally has them. His smug satisfaction is written all over his face as if he's already imagining showing them off. Little Chili, meanwhile, is stuck in her usual indecisive loop. She holds up two items and waves them in front of Ah-Fei, asking which one looks better. Ah-Fei, trying to be helpful but clearly out of his depth, admits he likes both. Before the debate can spiral into Chili's usual overthinking routine, their attention shifts to Huojiao. Hujiao stands apart from them, her gaze fixed on Zelfei and Zelwu, who are quietly closing the massive door to the treasury. Something feels wrong. The way they're moving, so deliberate and secretive, sets off warning bells in her mind. She calls them out, demanding to know why they're locking the door. The stewards turn to her with sly, smug smiles plastered across their faces. Their expressions radiate trouble, making it clear they aren't up to anything good. Instead of answering directly, they taunt her, asking if the reason isn't already obvious. Before anyone has a chance to react, the stewards unleash powerful magic. The weapons the group had just chosen are ripped from their hands and pulled into the air, swirling together in a storm of energy. The team stares, stunned, as Zelfei and Zelwu transform the confiscated weapons into powerful gear for themselves. The stewards stand before them, now heavily armed and looking far too confident. They announce coldly that they have no intention of letting anyone leave alive. With an air of chilling satisfaction, they explain that their mission is to eliminate the chosen warriors before they can reach the king. The smug expressions on their faces make it painfully clear that this was their plan all along. Afi clenches his fists, likely regretting how much he just celebrated his new gear, while little Chili looks like she's processing the betrayal a little too slowly. Huojiao, however, tightens her stance, clearly ready for the fight she knows is about to begin. The stewards now stand fully equipped, looking like walking arsenals ready to wipe out an army. They wear smug grins, clearly reveling in their newfound power. Little Chili, still trying to wrap her head around what just happened, wonders aloud if these stewards are even real or just NPCs. Her voice wavers slightly, her doubt and confusion clear. Hujiao doesn't bother humoring her question. She brushes it off, saying it doesn't matter what they are. What matters is simple: they need to be defeated, no matter what. Her tone is sharp, snapping the group back to reality. Without wasting another second, the three of them rush at Zelfei and Zelwu, their determination overcoming their hesitation. But the fight doesn't go as planned. The stewards, now ridiculously overpowered thanks to the stolen weapons, barely put in any effort. Zelwu swings a sword with a casual flick, unleashing a massive wind explosion that sends the group flying like ragdolls. They hit the ground hard, the impact shaking their confidence even more than their bodies. Zelfei, standing unscathed, smirks as he watches their struggles. The enjoyment on his face is almost sickening, like he's toying with them just for fun. The stewards mock the warriors, laughing at the very idea that they thought they stood a chance. With half the power of the king's treasury in their hands, the stewards are unstoppable, or at least, that's what they want everyone to believe. To them, the fight is over before it even begins. Hujiao, however, is not laughing. Panic starts to rise within her. She realizes just how dire the situation is. Their opponents are far stronger than she expected, and with just one move, almost half their strength is gone. Her mind races as she assesses the situation, quickly calculating that this battle feels more like the difficulty of a massive 50-player quest. The thought hits her hard. If their side is struggling this much, then the situation on the side of Zhang Yu must be even worse. The odds of him facing something equally, if not more, dangerous seem terrifyingly high. Meanwhile, the king sits in his throne, deep in thought as his mind drifts to the concept of immortality. He knows it's something emperors have chased for centuries. He questions their motivations. Was it for pleasure, to gain more power, or simply out of fear of death? To him, all of those reasons are pathetic, rooted in greed and vanity. Such desires, he believes, are unworthy of someone who calls themselves an emperor. Of course, the king doesn't lump himself into the same category. His pursuit of immortality, he claims, is different. He convinces himself it's not selfish, but a duty. He believes his desire is the will of the people, the spirit of the times, and even a mandate from heaven itself. It's a convenient justification, one that lets him pretend he's better than the emperors he criticizes. His mind drifts further back to his early life. He remembers seeing the world as a filthy, chaotic place, a chopping board covered in blood and misery. To him, humanity wasn't much better than fish waiting to be slaughtered. Monsters roamed freely, devouring anyone in their path. Even the land itself, mountains, rivers, and lakes, seemed like they were feeding on people, and when things couldn't get worse, they did. People turned on each other, resorting to cannibalism to survive. The king tells himself that heaven must have been disgusted by all this suffering, and that's why it chose him. He believes he was the one destined to bring order to the madness, the one to reshape the world. It's a convenient story, one he clings to tightly. He recalls a pivotal moment from his youth, a moment that changed everything. Back then, he worked under brutal conditions, doing grueling labor that pushed him to his limits. One day, he stopped to rest, if only for a moment. That small break enraged a powerful overseer, who furiously threw him aside. The man didn't stop there. He turned on an elderly man who apologized on the king's behalf, berating him for daring to show weakness. The bald overseer, drunk on his own authority, ignored all reasoning. He went further, placing his foot on the old man's head to humiliate him. That was the breaking point for the king. Something snapped in the young king. Rage bubbled up, hot and uncontrollable. Without thinking, he grabbed the heavy stone strapped to his back and swung it with all his strength. The stone smashed into the overseer's head, silencing him permanently. This act of rebellion changed everything. The other laborers, long oppressed and beaten down, saw him as a symbol of defiance. From that moment, he became their leader, the one who stood up against tyranny. Of course, in his version of the story, this wasn't just a rebellion, it was the beginning of his divine mission, the moment heaven supposedly chose him to reshape the world. The king rallied the weak and rose against the powerful oppressors. With those who believed in his vision, he fought back against the ruling class, dismantling their iron grip on power. He brought an end to the wars that had ravaged the land, eradicated the demons that terrorized the people, and rebuilt society from the ground up. What was once a fractured and broken world became a strong and prosperous kingdom under his rule, or at least that's how he tells the story. In his mind, these achievements were no ordinary feats. They were proof of his greatness, a divine justification for his pursuit of immortality. He saw himself as heaven's chosen one, the only man capable of rewriting the fate of the world and pulling humanity out of its endless misery. His ego wasn't just inflated, it had reached mythological proportions. As he reflects on his accomplishments, the king takes pride in how his legacy had already begun to grow through his bloodline. He saw his family as a continuation of his greatness, a living testament to his unmatched brilliance. But just as he was basking in the glory of it all, reality delivered a brutal slap to his face. A group of so-called doctors came to him with devastating news. They told him without hesitation that he was going to die. The words hit him harder than any enemy ever had. For a man who had convinced himself he was untouchable, the thought of his own mortality was unthinkable. Panic gripped him. The idea that the world could go on without him felt impossible. In his mind, the people only thrived because of his presence. Without him, he believed everything would crumble into darkness. The kingdoms of Tapini, which he viewed as the light of the world, would be left without their guiding star. He refused to accept such a fate. The thought of death consumed him, dragging him into a spiral of despair. Anger bubbled up inside him, and he lashed out not at the doctors, but at the heavens themselves. Furious and desperate, he cried out, demanding answers. If heaven had chosen him to lead, to shape the world, why would it abandon him now? In his desperation, the king made a vow. He wouldn't die, not yet, not ever. The very idea of his own death was unacceptable. He resolved to do whatever it took to avoid it. No price would be too high, no sacrifice too great. In his mind, his life wasn't just his own, it belonged to the world. In his moment of desperation, heaven seemed to hear his pleas. He claimed that heaven acknowledged him, inspiring him with a way to survive. But the price was horrifying. To secure his immortality, his actions grew darker. His castle was engulfed in flames, and his daughter begged him to stop, her voice breaking through the chaos. She pleaded, accusing him of losing his mind. With his eyes glowing red and his expression cold, the king answers her in a voice devoid of any humanity. He insists he isn't mad, but more rational than ever before. In his warped perspective, his choice is not only logical but noble. He demands that his daughter accept what he calls the ultimate honor, becoming his nourishment. To him, her death isn't a tragedy, it's a transformation, a necessary step toward his grand vision. He rationalizes it further, claiming that she will simply turn into light and return to the sun, an act he describes as glorious. But there's nothing glorious about what happens next. Without hesitation, he sacrifices his own child, justifying it as the price for his immortality. In his twisted mind, this is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary step toward ensuring his so-called destiny. Now with Zhang Yu, also known as Lu Li, the king sees the final piece of his puzzle. He views Lu Li as the perfect vessel, the ultimate prize that will complete his ascension. His voice drips with disturbing certainty as he claims Lu Li should feel honored to play such a significant role in what he calls a historic moment. The king continues to drain the life energy from Lu Li, savoring the apparent victory. His smugness grows as he feels the strength flowing into him. But then something happens that he doesn't expect. Lu Li suddenly disappears, vanishing right before his eyes. Confusion flashes across the king's face as he tries to make sense of what just happened. Above him, Lu Li reappears, standing tall and looking entirely unimpressed. His confident posture is a direct contrast to the king's bewilderment. With a calm but cutting tone, Lu Li dismisses the king's dramatic tale, calling it nothing more than a boring story. The king quickly realizes the Lu Li he was draining earlier was just a clone. Lu Li doesn't stop there, criticizing the king for acting so sanctimoniously. He points out that the king is no different from the vain and greedy individuals he had condemned earlier. The insult visibly annoys the king, but instead of addressing it, he dismisses Lu Li's words with a smug wave of his hand. He declares that someone as ignorant as Lu Li could never hope to understand his so-called greatness. To him, Lu Li's opinions are beneath consideration. Turning his focus away, the king calls for his two guards to hurry down and join him if they finish their task. Moments later, the stewards Zelfa and Zelwu arrive, strutting into the room like they own the place. Their smugness is practically suffocating. Before they can even speak, Lu Li immediately recognizes their voices. Anger flashes across his face as he accuses them of betraying him and his team. The stewards, however, show no remorse. They wear their betrayal like a badge of honor, openly admitting it. To make matters worse, they start boasting. Zelfa grins as he announces they've already dealt with Lu Li's 3 teammates, taking them out without breaking a sweat. Zelwu chimes in, her tone dripping with arrogance as if eliminating his team was the easiest thing in the world. Lu Li's anger boils over. Fueled by rage, he rushes toward the stewards, confronting them head-on. He demands to know if they have a death wish, his fury blazing in his voice. But Zelfa and Zelwu remain completely unfazed. They look at him like he's a minor inconvenience, not a threat. They mock him openly, warning him not to overestimate himself. Zelwu casually declares that she represents the staff of the king, while Zelfa claims he represents the sword of the king. Their words carry an air of finality, as though they've already decided his fate. The stewards then shift their focus, channeling their energy toward the king. The room seems to hum with power as the energy flows into him, fueling a transformation that makes the air feel heavy and suffocating. The king begins to undergo his so-called king guard transformation, and his body starts radiating overwhelming power. He rambles arrogantly, belittling the idea of a warrior. To him, the title is meaningless, and killing someone like Lu Li is no harder than crushing an ant beneath his heel. Meanwhile, in the real world, Hua Jiao and Little Chili take off their headpieces after the system notifies them that their game session is over. Little Chili sits there, visibly annoyed, her frustration bubbling over. She starts venting, questioning how everything went from a simple treasure hunt to NPCs flipping the script and becoming overpowered bosses. It's like they went from a casual walk to a full-on marathon with no warning. Hua Jiao, ever the calm one, speculates that they might have accidentally triggered a hidden quest, setting off the chaos. Her voice is steady, but even she can't completely mask her unease. Little Chili isn't buying it, though. She points out the ridiculous power of the enemies they faced, highlighting how these so-called NPCs were capable of wiping them out with a single move. To her, it's not a hidden quest, it's a scam. Hua Jiao reluctantly agrees, admitting that she underestimated the situation. The strength of those two bosses was on the level of a 100-player raid, something far beyond what they were prepared for. This realization hits hard, and Hua Jiao's concern shifts to Zhang Yu. She starts worrying about how he's supposed to handle this nightmare all on his own. Trying to shake off the tension, Hua Jiao stretches her arms and casually asks her younger sister how much time is left until their in-game resurrection. Little Chili checks the timer and says it'll take about 30 minutes. Hua Jiao sighs, suggesting they grab some coffee to pass the time since it's clearly going to be a long night. Of course, Little Chili, true to form, doesn't let the moment pass without inserting her own preferences. Instead of plain coffee, she says she'd rather have a banana latte. Hua Jiao rolls her eyes but doesn't argue. Outside, the weather mirrors their mood. Dark clouds loom in the sky, hinting at an incoming storm. Afi stands by the window, watching the scene while smoking. His usual smug attitude is nowhere to be seen. His face is gloomy, and his thoughts seem far away. He wonders what he's even doing, feeling a wave of helplessness crash over him. Despite all his efforts, he can't shake the feeling that he's powerless to help his second brother. The thought eats at him, leaving a bitter taste. Frustrated, he crushes his cigarette with more force than necessary, lets out a heavy sigh, and drops into his chair. Without a word, he puts his gaming gear back on, his determination renewed. In his mind, he tells Zhang Yu to hold on just a little longer. He and the others are coming back to help, and this time, they're not holding anything back. Inside the game, Lu Li charges at the king with everything he's got, aiming for a direct hit. His attack is strong, but it fails miserably. Refusing to give up, he activates his backstab ability, teleporting behind the king to launch another strike. This time, the attack lands, but the result is disappointing. It barely scratches the king, leaving only a tiny mark. The king turns around slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then with a smirk, he mocks Lu Li, clearly unimpressed. His words cut deep as he questions whether that weak attack is truly the best Lu Li can manage. The mocking tone is enough to make anyone's blood boil, but Lu Li forces himself to stay calm. The king retaliates with a powerful strike of his own. He unleashes a massive wave of energy, the sheer force of which makes the air around them ripple. Lu Li braces himself, fully expecting to be hit. However, to his surprise, the attack doesn't harm him. Instead, it obliterates everything behind him, leaving a massive trail of destruction in its wake. Pointing his sword at Lu Li, the king explains his reasoning, his tone dripping with arrogance. He says he held back on purpose, not wanting to damage what he calls his perfect new vessel. He gloats, suggesting that now Lu Li has seen the gap between their strength, he should simply surrender and accept the so-called baptism. In the king's eyes, Lu Li is nothing more than a naive child playing a game he doesn't understand. The king views himself as someone forged in unimaginable horrors, a survivor of endless bloodshed. He believes that Lu Li, with his limited experience, is just another overconfident fool who thinks a few minor victories and small battles are enough to challenge someone like him. The words weigh heavily on Lu Li. He knows the king isn't wrong. They're not on the same level. Fear begins creeping into his thoughts, threatening to overwhelm him. For a moment, doubt clouds his mind, and the gap in their power feels insurmountable. But then, something shifts. Lu Li realizes that standing still and giving in to panic will solve nothing. If he freezes now, it's over. Determined not to let fear paralyze him, he steadies himself. The situation is dire, but he refuses to back down. Instead, he prepares himself to keep moving, no matter how overwhelming the challenge ahead may be. The king watches as Lu Li attempts to retreat and chuckles, calling the young warrior incorrigible. His voice is filled with mockery, as if he's humored by the idea that someone like Lu Li thinks he can escape. Meanwhile, Lu Li uses his cloning ability, creating a distraction to divert the king's attention while he conceals himself. He moves swiftly, lodging his death dagger into the wall and using it as a foothold to steady himself. Gasping for breath, he pulls out a recovery potion and gulps it down, regaining some of his strength. It doesn't take much for Lu Li to realize that fighting the king head-on is out of the question. The difference in their power is so massive it's almost laughable. A direct confrontation would be nothing short of suicide. Instead, Lu Li resolves to play smart, relying on hit-and-run tactics. If he can stall long enough, maybe reinforcements will arrive. It's a slim hope, but it's the only one he has right now. The king glances upward, smirking at Lu Li's attempts to hide. Amused by the strategy, he mocks Lu Li, comparing it to a game of cat and mouse. But of course the king can't resist inflating his already massive ego. He sneers and declares that he isn't just a cat, he's a tiger. His arrogance practically oozes from every word, as if simply saying it makes it true. Deciding to prove his superiority, the king unleashes telekinetic storm, gravity control, a move so powerful it immediately reveals Lu Li's hiding spot. The air grows heavy, the energy pressing down on Lu Li like an invisible weight. The crushing force makes it difficult for him to move, his body straining against the overwhelming power. The king watches with sadistic satisfaction, clearly enjoying Lu Li's struggle. Seeing his prey cornered, the king revels in the moment. To him, this isn't a fight, it's a performance, and he's the star of the show. With no other options, Lu Li and his clone launch a desperate attack. They move in unison, putting everything they have into their assault. But their efforts are wasted. The king's impenetrable defensive shield absorbs their strikes as if they were nothing more than a breeze. Not a single scratch mars the barrier, and the futility of their attack is painfully clear. The king, thoroughly amused by the desperate attempts of Lu Li, mockingly compliments his cloning technique. He admits that it's quite entertaining to watch. With a smug grin, he muses aloud that once he takes over Lu Li's body, he might try using the cloning ability himself, purely for fun, of course. His arrogance is insufferable, as if he's already claimed victory, and Lu Li is just a toy for his amusement. Raising his sword, the king prepares to strike, but Lu Li refuses to give up. He charges forward, dagger in hand, in a bold attempt to land a hit. The king, however, remains completely unfazed. With almost laughable ease, he catches the dagger midair, his grip firm and unshaken. As if the king's smugness wasn't enough, Zhao Wu and Zhao Fei float ominously around him like bodyguards on a power trip. They watch the scene unfold with the kind of smug amusement that makes you want to roll your eyes. Zhao Fei breaks the silence, mockingly asking Lu Li if he truly believes the mountain he's facing contains only the king. Zhao Wu joins in, smirking as she questions why Lu Li still thinks this is a one-on-one fight. Their taunts are dripping with overconfidence, as if they're already celebrating their victory. Without warning, Zhao Wu uses gravity manipulation, hurling Lu Li into a nearby lake with a force so strong it feels like the air itself is crushing him. The impact sends him plunging deep into the water, the world around him spinning. Stunned, he struggles to get his bearings. As he sinks, he quickly realizes just how overwhelming the situation has become. The weapons the stewards transformed into earlier aren't just decorative, they're alive. Moving independently, they attack with precision, as though he's facing 3 cross-level bosses at once. The sheer unfairness of it all hits him like a brick. If there was ever a moment to hold nothing back, this is it. Meanwhile, on the surface, Zelfa glances at the lake and casually wonders aloud if Zhao Wu might have gone a bit overboard. He asks her if she accidentally damaged the king's precious new vessel. His tone is light, but his words carry a hint of mockery, poking at the possibility that she made a mistake. Zhao Wu's smile vanishes instantly. She glares at her brother, clearly annoyed by the comment, and snaps at him to stop talking nonsense. She reassures him with a sharp tone that her attack was nothing more than a little push, not enough to cause any serious harm. The king peers into the lake, his sharp eyes catching the turbulence on the surface. Something doesn't feel right, but before he can react, Luli bursts from the depths with incredible speed. In a bold move, he launches a surprise attack. The assault is unexpected and manages to land, leaving a small cut on the king's face. The steward's smugness vanishes immediately. They are clearly rattled by this turn of events. They hadn't expected Luli to recover so quickly, let alone get close enough to land a hit. The king, however, isn't angry. Instead, he seems amused. His fingers brush against the small cut on his face and a faint grin forms. He chuckles, finding it entertaining that his perfect vessel has managed to surprise him. The king's curiosity begins to grow as he observes Luli more closely. Emerging from the water, Luli looks different. His entire presence feels unfamiliar, radiating a strange new power. It turns out Luli had activated a mythical-grade artifact, the Phantom God's Earring. This rare piece of equipment allows the wearer to completely change their race. Along with the transformation comes new appearances, passive talents, and even language proficiency, making it a game-changer in combat. The artifact's description mentions several common races like humans, elves, and sirens, but Luli's choice is far from ordinary. Luli is transformed into the Phantom God of Fishermen race. His appearance is striking, and his newfound power makes his presence feel overwhelming. Zelfa, now visibly furious, charges at Luli without hesitation, calling him out for his audacity. His anger fuels his attack, and he swings with the intent to make Luli regret his every decision. But before Zelfa's attack can connect, Luli dives back into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface in an instant. The transformation grants him race-specific passive talents, and they immediately come into play. His movement speed in water doubles, making him nearly impossible to catch, and his ability to hold his breath is significantly extended. Zelfa, now looking more annoyed than intimidating, shouts into the water, cursing Luli and demanding he show himself. His frustration is almost laughable as his voice echoes uselessly over the lake. Zelwu joins in, calling out for Luli to come out, her tone sharper, but equally ineffective. The waters remain eerily silent as Luli swims effortlessly below the surface. His movements are smooth and swift, making it impossible for the stewards or the king to pinpoint his location. The lake, which was once just another obstacle, has now become the strongest advantage of Luli. Suddenly, Luli explodes out of the lake with incredible speed, his movements fluid and precise. Running across the surface of the water as if it's solid ground, he uses his newfound agility to its fullest. Before the king or his stewards can react, Luli closes the distance and sneaks behind the king. His dagger glints under the light, poised for a deadly strike. Just as the attack is about to land, Zelfa steps in at the last moment. With a well-timed parry, Zelfa deflects the attack with enough force to send Luli flying through the air, propelling him nearly 100 meters backward. While still soaring through the air, Luli doesn't waste a single second. He activates the Phantom God's Earring again, triggering another transformation. This time, he shifts into the Bullman race. His body grows bulkier, his muscles expanding as his power surges. The transformation increases his attack strength by 20%, though at the cost of reducing his intelligence by 20%. Not that anyone's noticing the brain power drop right now. The Bullman race also grants him a self-regeneration ability, an invaluable tool in this relentless battle. Fully transformed and stronger than ever, Luli charges forward again, his determination unwavering. Without hesitation, Luli launches himself straight at the king, channeling all of his power into his ultimate move, rending Burst Blade. The air itself seems to split apart as the attack tears toward its target with incredible force. The king, ever confident in his strength, stands unmoving. He raises his arm to block the attack, treating it as if it's nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But for all his arrogance, the king underestimates the sheer power of Luli's strike. The attack slams into his arm, leaving a deep and unmistakable wound. The impact shocks even the king, whose smug demeanor falters ever so slightly. Zelfei and Zelwu, always quick to boast about their invincibility, suddenly look less sure of themselves. Their confident expressions crumble as they rush to express their concern. The sight of the king bleeding visibly rattles them. Angered by the defiance of Luli, Zelfei immediately charges at him, cursing him and swearing revenge. His attacks come with furious precision, but Luli doesn't back down. During the heated clash, Luli's left arm gets injured. Zelfei looks triumphant for a brief moment, but doesn't last long. The Bulma's regeneration ability activates almost instantly, healing Luli's arm as if the injury had never happened. The king doesn't flinch at his injury. Instead, he claps his hands with enthusiasm, his face lighting up with genuine amusement. To him, the battle isn't a matter of survival, it's a performance, and he's thoroughly entertained. He declares that Lu Li is full of surprises, almost as if he's congratulating him for being more interesting than the average opponent. The king's tone feels celebratory, like a host complimenting a guest at a grand event. Meanwhile, Zelwu's confidence wavers as she notices the wound on the king's arm. Her expression tightens with worry, and she quickly assures him that she'll handle it. Without wasting time, she casts a healing spell, carefully tending to the injury until the damage is completely erased. The king, however, pays no attention to the fuss over his arm. His focus is locked entirely on Lu Li, his grin growing wider with every passing second. There's something unsettling about his expression, a mix of admiration and hunger. He remarks on how much this vessel, Lu Li, pleases him, his tone dripping with sinister intent. To the king, Lu Li is no longer just an opponent to defeat. He's something far more valuable, a perfect scabbard, as the king calls it. The king, in his usual self-absorbed way, declares that Lu Li must have been sent by the heavens specifically for him, perfectly crafted to hold the unparalleled sword that is himself. His arrogance is almost unbearable, as if he truly believes the universe revolves around him. With mocking curiosity, the king taunts Lu Li further. He questions whether there are any other hidden tricks or features left to reveal, treating him like a toy with surprises yet to be uncovered. His condescending tone makes it clear that he's still confident in his victory, no matter what Lu Li does next. Lu Li, however, knows the truth. The situation is dire and can feel it in his bones. Even his strongest move, rending Burst Blade, barely made a dent in the king. If he's going to turn the tide, he needs to risk everything on his last and most powerful technique. Taking a deep breath, Lu Li steadies himself. His determination hardens and he activates his ultimate skill, Hidden Dragon in the Abyss. A massive dragon begins to form, its sheer presence overwhelming the battlefield. The ground trembles beneath its weight and the air grows heavy with its power. The beast radiates strength, its every movement commanding attention. For a moment, the battlefield belongs to the dragon and Lu Li channels every ounce of his energy into the technique. The king watches the scene unfold, his expression far too calm for someone facing a mythical beast. His smug confidence doesn't waver. Instead of fear or concern, his eyes sparkle with amusement. To him, this isn't a life or death moment, it's a spectacle, something to sit back and enjoy. Lu Li summons all of his strength and sends the massive dragon hurtling toward the king. The attack is fierce, tearing through the air with unstoppable force. The energy crackles and roars, a testament to the sheer power behind it. The king, still brimming with arrogance, doesn't flinch. Instead, he counters with his own move, Sword-Edge Storm, Cleave the Sky. The two attacks collide with devastating force. The ground shakes violently, cracks spreading like spider webs, while debris scatters in all directions. Smoke and dust blanket the battlefield, turning it into a chaotic wasteland. The sheer intensity of the clash leaves the area in ruins, making it almost impossible to see what remains. And as the dust begins to clear, the king steps forward, completely unscathed. His grin is as smug as ever, radiating an unbearable sense of superiority. He looks at Lu Li as if the attack was nothing more than an amusing light show. With an almost mocking tone, he belittles Lu Li's efforts, clearly confident that his own strength is far beyond anything Lu Li could muster. But the king's overconfidence blinds him to the truth. He's so busy gloating that he doesn't realize the dragon he destroyed wasn't the real attack, it was a decoy. The real dragon looms behind him, its energy surging with raw power. Before the king can react, the dragon strikes, landing a direct hit. The explosion is immense, sending shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. The force of the blast shakes the very ground beneath them, its intensity impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, it seems as though the tide is turning. But when the smoke clears, the king is still standing. This time, however, he's encased in a glowing shield. Zelwu, ever the loyal lapdog, has swooped in to save him at the last second with her protective magic. Her intervention keeps him standing, though it's clear even she wasn't prepared for the full force of the attack. The king coughs and steadies himself, the illusion of his untouchable strength slipping slightly. His pride takes a hit as he grudgingly admits the attack was stronger than he anticipated. His arrogance, however, refuses to let him admit any kind of defeat. Instead, he twists the situation, praising Lu Li's cleverness like he's some sort of judge in a competition. Lu Li, however, takes note of the situation. He realizes that the king has been weakened. The earlier attack, though not decisive, was effective. Hope flickers within him, but the moment is short-lived. The king's eyes begin to glow with an ominous red aura, radiating malice as he channels his power. Without hesitation, he unleashes telekinetic storm, gravity control once more. The air grows heavy and Lu Li is bound within a ball of water, unable to move. Around him, massive trunks materialize, all aimed at him with deadly precision. The king watches, his expression filled with mockery. He taunts Lu Li, warning him against any thoughts of escape. His voice drips with arrogance as he raises his staff, commanding Lu Li to accept the so-called baptism and dedicate his life to the king's great journey. Adding insult to injury, the king refers to Lu Li as a warrior, pausing briefly before delivering an unexpected twist. He then calls him a player. The word catches Lu Li off guard and his composure cracks. Shocked, he stammers, unable to process what he just heard. The king lets out a chuckle, his tone laced with mockery. He looks at Lu Li with a mix of pity and disdain, as if explaining something to a child who just doesn't get it. He says it shouldn't be so hard to comprehend. According to him, the heavens have already revealed to him the ultimate secret of this world. With a sinister gleam in his eyes, the king explains that the very title of player is an insult in itself. To him is the height of arrogance. The heavens told him that everything in this world, every blade of grass, every bouquet of flowers, every word spoken, and every expression made, exists solely to serve one purpose: to entertain the players. At first he thought it was just a horrifying metaphor, something symbolic from the heavens. But then his intelligence was enhanced and everything became painfully clear. The king delves deeper, his voice carrying both bitterness and fury. He talks about the cruel truth of this world. There is no cause and effect for him. His memories are nothing but fragments stitched together. His life, no matter how grand or meaningful it seems, is bound by rules that endlessly repeat themselves. Every day, every hour, every moment of his existence is preordained, looping endlessly like a cruel joke. He introduces himself again, but this time with a tone filled with both pride and despair. He is Jin, the king to whom hundreds of thousands of people have pledged their allegiance. He is the savior of this era, the man who built a kingdom from chaos and saved countless lives. And yet, he is nothing more than a chess piece, his entire life a tool for the entertainment of the players. The king's voice rises as he yells, his anger spilling over. He refuses to accept this fate. He insists that he is no ordinary man. He is the king chosen by the heavens themselves. He declares that he was born not to follow destiny, but to destroy it, to subvert the cruel design that binds him. Pointing his blade at Lu Li, the king's fury intensifies. He accuses Lu Li and the other players of being invaders in his world. To him, they are the real enemies, the ones who have come to exploit and disrupt everything. With an unyielding roar, he declares his intention to expel them all, no matter the cost. Zhao Wu, ever the loyal servant, speaks up, addressing the king with reverence. She calls him majesty in a tone that borders on worship. Zelfa joins in, adding that the king's merit lies in the future and his actions will bring benefits to generations to come. Lu Li stands frozen in thought, his mind racing as he tries to make sense of the king's claims. An entity made of data gaining the ability to think independently. How is that even possible? It goes against everything logical. The more the king talks about this heaven, the more questions flood Lu Li's mind. What exactly is this heaven the king keeps mentioning? Whatever it is, it must be the source of this bizarre situation. The king interrupts Lu Li's reflection, his voice calm yet filled with malice. He muses aloud, curious about one thing. After taking over the bodies of these so-called players, what happens to their souls? His tone makes it sound like a casual question, but the menace behind it is impossible to miss. Lu Li takes a deep breath and decides to ask one last question before making his next move. He looks at the king and says he needs to know something. The king, growing impatient, waves his hand and tells Lu Li to hurry up and stop wasting time. Lu Li asks if the king knows someone named Ham Yixiao. The question hangs in the air, and for a brief moment the king looks thoughtful. He repeats the name slowly, saying it sounds familiar. But before Lu Li can press him further, the king's face hardens and his patience runs out. With a sinister grin, he tells Lu Li that if he really wants answers, he can go to hell and ask his question there. Before the king can attack, Lu Li moves swiftly, activating his phantom god's earring once again. His appearance shifts, transforming him back into the bowman. Without hesitation, the king launches a brutal attack, his energy-infused trunks piercing through Lu Li's body. But something doesn't add up. The king pauses, his eyes narrowing as he realizes the truth. It's just another clone. Far above, on one of the upper floors, the real Lu Li stands, catching his breath. He's relieved that he thought ahead and placed a clone in his safe location earlier. Transformations have a cooldown of 30 minutes, so he knows he can't afford to get caught again. Preparing his next move, Lu Li activates the Phantom God's earring once more, this time choosing a new form, the Phantom God Lizardman. His body shifts again, taking on the sleek, agile features of his new race. The transformation comes with unique passive talents. His climbing speed increases by 50%, and he gains the ability to camouflage, making him nearly invisible. With his new abilities, Lu Li starts climbing the walls of the abyss. The king closes his eyes, his voice dripping with mockery. He remarks that his new vessel is far too dishonest for his liking. With a sinister tone, he declares that he must first break his hands and legs before repairing them later. The king's grin widens, his arrogance on full display as if he's already claimed victory. Raising his staff, the king commands, "Arise," and the staff lights up with a menacing glow. He activates telekinetic storm, elemental control, and the water ball hovering above begins to freeze. In seconds, the entire mass turns to solid ice, sealing off the exit completely. Luli curses under his breath, his frustration evident as he realizes there's no way out. The exit is sealed, trapping him in the abyss with no escape route. The king isn't done yet. With a grin that promises more chaos, he raises his staff again. This time, shards of ice break off and start raining down, creating a deadly storm of frozen spikes. Clinging to the wall, Luli dodges the falling shards as best he can, his breathing heavy and labored. Each movement feels more difficult than the last as the cold begins to seep into his body. He realizes the harsh truth: lizards are cold-blooded creatures and their body temperature is directly affected by their surroundings. The freezing environment is slowing him down, stiffening his movements and draining his energy. One of the ice shards strikes him, and the impact sends him crashing to the ground. The pain is written all over his face as he struggles to push himself up. The king watches with satisfaction, his voice cold and mocking. He declares that Luli cannot escape his grasp, his tone dripping with superiority. With a flick of his staff, he commands the ice shards to pin Luli onto a slab of ice. The shards pierce through his limbs, leaving him immobilized. The king taunts him further, his words cutting deep. He tells Luli to go ahead and run if he still can, mocking him with every word. Pinned down and drained of energy, Luli feels the crushing weight of defeat. He reflects on his situation, realizing he has no more tricks left, no more methods to escape. The fight has pushed him to his absolute limit, and for the first time, despair begins to creep into his thoughts. The king steps closer to Luli, his eyes filled with malice. Grabbing him by the neck, the king begins to choke him, savoring the moment as Luli struggles helplessly. The situation seems grim, and Luli's strength fades rapidly under the king's grip. But just as the king's victory seems inevitable, a sudden explosion pierces through the ice ball above. A massive flame ball shatters the icy barrier, lighting up the dark abyss. The shock breaks the tension as the king turns, startled. It's Afi's fiery explosion attack, signaling their return to the game. Flames roar all around as Afi and Little Chili charge toward the king, their expressions fierce and determined. They've clearly come back with a vengeance. Leading the way, Hua Jiao wastes no time. She stomps the ground with full force, activating her mountain-shaking stomp. The attack hits hard, the ground trembling under its impact. The shockwave sends the king flying backward, caught off guard by the sudden assault. All three of them call out to Luli, shouting that they're here. The king rises to his feet, brushing off the dust but clearly rattled. His composure falters for a moment as he processes what just happened. Zhao and Zhao both wide-eyed, rush to his side. Zhao voice is sharp with disbelief as she points out the trio, wondering how it's even possible for them to be alive. She turns to the king, addressing him as Majesty, and reminds him that she and Zhao personally killed them earlier. Zhao nods, backing her up. He insists that they absolutely died to the sword wind explosion. Both of them look visibly confused, their confidence cracking as they struggle to make sense of the situation. The king raises his hands, silencing them. His expression shifts from confusion to calculated interest as he watches the trio. He declares that there's no need for further explanation. This, he says, is the mind-boggling nature of the player race. Their ability to return from the dead is unlike anything else in this world. The king's tone grows darker, his grin returning as he speaks. If he can fully understand the player race, he muses, and master the body-snatching technique to kill them permanently, then they will all serve as their perfect vessels in the future. The thought clearly excites him, and his gaze hardens with renewed determination. Luli quickly warns Afi, Little Chili, and Hua Jiao to be cautious of the face on the king's chest. Afi, ever the loudmouth, openly wonders what's so special about it. Luli explains that the face is the source of the king's body-snatching skill. He emphasizes that it's likely more dangerous than just damaging their in-game characters. It's something much worse. Afi waves off the explanation with a dismissive tone, saying they can deal with all the creepy face talk after they save their second brother. His focus is on the here and now. Little Chili, determined as ever, declares she's ready to help too. Meanwhile, the king, unimpressed by their reunion, turns to Zhao and Zhao. His voice is cold as he commands them to get rid of these troublesome bugs. The stewards, always eager to obey, reply in unison, understood, their synchronized voices adding an eerie edge. Zhao steps forward, glaring at the group with pure hatred. She curses them for embarrassing her in front of the king and declares that she'll crush them all into fleshy pulp. Her tone is dripping with fury, and she's clearly itching for revenge. Little Chili glances at Afi and calls out to him, saying she's on her way to deal with Zhao. Afi nods, his tone cocky as always, and tells her they'll take care of Zhao first. Without hesitation, both of them unleash their fiery comet burst attacks simultaneously, sending blazing comets hurtling toward Zelwu. Zelwu, however, remains calm. She activates her gravity barrier, a powerful shield that holds firm against the incoming comets. The flaming projectiles slam into the barrier, but it doesn't falter. Zelwu smirks, taunting them as she asks if this is what they call magic. Her tone is dripping with arrogance, as if their efforts are nothing more than a joke to her. Afi and Little Chili refuse to back down. They exchange a quick glance, silently agreeing on their next move. Combining their strength, they activate their dual fusion skill, Dance of Fire Tornadoes. The two fiery tornadoes twist and spiral towards Zelwu's gravity barrier with overwhelming force, burning hotter and fiercer with every second. The tornadoes collide with the barrier, and for a moment, it seems like Zelwu's smug confidence might hold. But the combined attack proves too much, and the barrier shatters under the pressure, unable to withstand the fiery assault. Zelwu's eyes widen in disbelief as her defense falls apart. She curses them loudly, calling their combined attack two matchstick skills and complaining about how they've turned everything into a foggy, rainy mess. The air is filled with steam and smoke, making it hard for her to see clearly. On the other side of the battlefield, Huojiao squares off against Zelfa. She activates her mountain-shaking technique, slamming the ground with tremendous force. Zelfa, wielding his sword with precision, parries the attack, scoffing at her effort. His voice drips with mockery as he taunts her, asking if an ant like her really thinks she can suppress him. He calls it wishful thinking and raises his sword to use the sword wind explosion, his confidence unwavering. But before he can even finish his sentence, Huojiao cuts him off. Without hesitation, she fires back with her mountain-shaking cannon X6, amplifying her attack to a devastating level. The sheer impact of the strike sends Zelfa flying through the air, crashing hard onto the ground. Zelfa struggles to get up, cursing her under his breath. He mutters that this big-booed, brainless lady is far stronger than he expected. His insult barely masks his embarrassment, his earlier confidence now shattered. Before Zelfa can recover, the king strides over, grabbing the sword that is Zelfa himself. Zelfa tries to explain, stammering nervously, but the king isn't having any of it. Without even looking at him, the king growls, telling Zelfa to shut up. The air grows heavy as the king's anger intensifies. A dark, menacing aura begins to radiate from him, thick and oppressive. His eyes burn with fury as he addresses the group, declaring that he won't tolerate any Tom, Dick, or Harry wasting his time. His voice is cold, filled with disgust at the thought of being challenged by what he sees as mere nuisances. Huojiao, standing her ground, braces herself. She can feel the weight of the king's aura pressing down on her, and her instincts scream that this is no ordinary attack. She mutters to herself, acknowledging how overwhelmingly powerful the king's presence is. The king raises his sword and with a single swing, unleashes the sword wind explosion. Blaze of energy tear through the air, their sheer speed and power cutting through everything in their path. The battlefield trembles as the slashes fly toward Luli and the others. Luli shouts a warning, telling everyone to watch out. Afi, Little Chili, and Huojiao freeze for a moment, their faces showing equal parts shock and fear. The attack is too fast, too strong, and they realize they might not be able to avoid it. Just then, a new presence arrives on the battlefield. The members of the Daybreak Guild charge in, their leader stepping to the front with unwavering confidence. His voice rings out loud and clear, cutting through the chaos as he reassures everyone not to lose hope. Even in the darkest moments, he declares the light will come at daybreak. The leader of the Daybreak Guild raises his shield and uses the shield parry skill, intercepting the sword wind explosion head-on. The clash creates a burst of energy, but the shield holds strong, stopping the attack in its tracks. The king is startled by the sudden interference. Luli stares at the members of the Daybreak Guild, confused by their sudden appearance. He wonders how they ended up here in the middle of this chaotic battlefield. Before he can dwell on it, Afi casually slaps a hand on his shoulder, looking as smug as ever. With a knowing grin, Afi explains that after they got back online, they immediately discussed countermeasures. They knew there was no way they could handle a boss of this level on their own, so they went searching for reinforcements. By chance, they stumbled upon the Daybreak Guild nearby and convinced them to join in. The leader of the Daybreak Guild steps forward, his voice calm but firm. He addresses Luli, pointing out that while they could be considered acquaintances through fighting, from now on they will be friends. His words carry a sense of camaraderie, and that was quickly followed by a practical suggestion. The leader proposes that they split the reward for defeating the boss 50-50. Luli agrees without hesitation, saying it's no problem. But Afe, never one to stay quiet, interjects. He points out that their group is smaller and a 50-50 split isn't exactly fair. His tone is lighthearted, but the underlying complaint is clear. He's not about to let their effort go undervalued. Feng Ya, a member of the Daybreak Guild, steps in with his usual confidence. He dismisses the discussion with a casual remark, saying it's business as usual and volunteering to go first. Without waiting for further debate, he rushes toward the king, eager to test his strength. His voice is filled with excitement as he shouts that he's ready to face the boss that even Zhan Yu couldn't handle. The leader of the Daybreak Guild immediately takes charge, instructing everyone to get into their positions. His voice carries authority as he assigns roles. Old 3 on range damage, Old 5 on assist and control, and himself and Old 2 to follow Feng Ye in the attack. The team responds in unison, nodding and taking their positions without hesitation. Feng Ye charges at the king with full force, his sword swinging in a powerful arc. But the king, unimpressed, casually parries the attack with one hand. The sheer ease with which he blocks it leaves Feng Ye stunned. The impact sends him stumbling back, barely managing to keep his balance. Undeterred, Feng Ye steadies himself and smirks. He calls the king a lively one, clearly impressed by the challenge. Without skipping a beat, he launches himself forward again, swinging his sword with renewed determination. The king slams his staff onto the ground, activating gravity pulse. The force is immense, sending both Feng Ye and number 2 flying like ragdolls. They crash hard, barely managing to recover their footing. Just as the king seems ready to capitalize on his move, an arrow streaks through the air, striking with precision and pushing him back. The unexpected hit makes the king stagger, and both his staff and sword fall from his grip. Standing tall, number 3 from the Daybreak Guild smugly announces his success. He grins, clearly enjoying the moment, and declares that the king has been successfully disarmed. His self-satisfaction radiates like he just won the whole battle himself. Wasting no time, number 5 steps in, activating her skill. Tree branches shoot out from the ground, elongating with unnatural speed. The branches snake their way toward the king and wrap tightly around his legs, locking him in place. With confidence in her voice, she announces to the team that she's got him secured. Seizing the opportunity, Feng Ye and number 2 rush in for the attack, charging at the immobilized king from both sides. Feng Ye swings his sword with full force, unleashing Wolf Storm, while number 2 follows up with her Thunder Explosion using her Divine Sword. Their coordinated assault creates a whirlpool of water and thunder, swirling violently as it crashes into the king. The king clenches his fists and grits his teeth, his body tensing under the pressure of the combined attack. The whirlpool tears into him, and blood splatters from both sides of his body. Feng Ye, filled with adrenaline, yells at the king to die, convinced the attack has landed a decisive blow. But the victory is short-lived. Number 2 notices something is wrong. Her instincts scream that this isn't over, and she shouts a warning to Feng Ye, telling him to back off. Before they can retreat, the king's hands shoot out with terrifying speed. He grabs both Feng Ye and number 2 with his bare hands, locking them in a crushing grip. His voice, filled with cold finality, declares that it's over. Both Feng Ye and number 2 struggle against his hold, their faces contorted with effort as they try to free themselves. Feng Ye, never one to go quietly, curses the king, shouting at him to let go. The king doesn't even flinch at the insults. His grip tightens, and with a circular motion of his hands, he swings both of them through the air. The force of the throw sends them hurtling across the battlefield, smashing into the walls of the abyss with a sickening impact. Number 3 takes aim, drawing his invisible arrow with precision. He fires it straight at the king, confident in his attack. But the king, as always, is no ordinary opponent. With lightning-fast reflexes, he catches the invisible arrow midair, his grip firm and unshaken. Without hesitation, the king reverses the attack, hurling the arrow back at number 3 with devastating force. The arrow strikes its target, and a massive explosion follows. The impact sends number 3 flying, pinning him to the back wall. Blood splatters across the surface as the arrow pierces through his left shoulder, leaving him stuck. He grits his teeth, struggling to pull the arrow out, but it's lodged deep, and every movement sends waves of pain through his body. Meanwhile, the king turns his attention to the summon tree beast of number 5. With a single brutal punch, he smashes the beast into pieces, its massive form crumbling into nothing. Number 5 stares in horror at the remains of her summon, her face filled with worry and disbelief. She backs away as the king advances toward her, his presence radiating menace. Tears welling in her eyes, number 5 cries out, begging him not to come any closer. But the king is relentless. He raises his fist for another devastating punch, ready to crush her where she stands. Just before the attack lands, a leader of the Daybreak Guild rushes in, his shield raised. With perfect timing, he intercepts the blow, the impact reverberating through the shield of sparing number 5. The leader, calm and composed, tells number 5 to adjust her position and create some distance. His tone is steady, but the urgency in his words is clear. The king, undeterred, begins pounding on the leader's shield with a flurry of punches. Each strike lands with terrifying force, the sound of the blows echoing across the battlefield. The king taunts the leader, mocking his defensive skills and questioning how long he can possibly hold out. The leader holds firm, his shield absorbing each hit. His thoughts remain focused, reflecting on his role. To him, his shield is more than just a tool, it's a promise to protect his teammates, no matter the cost. But as for the king, the one who has hurt his comrades, the leader vows that he won't just face the shield. He'll face the sharp edge of the leader's sword as well. And as the leader of the Daybreak Guild speaks, a dramatic transformation begins. One side of his face starts glowing with a fierce red aura, and his right eye turns black with a piercing red pupil. The aura radiating from him grows darker and more intense, blending red and black energy as it swirls around his body. With his shield in one hand and his sword in the other, the leader looks like a force of nature, ready to retaliate with unmatched determination. The leader charges forward, swinging his sword with deadly precision, while the king counters with a relentless barrage of punches. Each clash between sword and fists sends out bursts of raw energy, creating shockwaves that ripple through the battlefield. The force is so immense that stones and water nearby are lifted into the air, caught in the chaotic energy of their battle. From a distance, Lu Li watches the chaos unfold. He quickly instructs his teammates to assist the wounded members of the Daybreak Guild. Little Chili rushes to number 3, kneeling beside him to assess the damage. She pulls the arrow from his shoulder, her hand steady despite the blood, and tells him to bear with the pain. Number 3 grits his teeth, his face pale, but he manages to nod. Ah Fei makes his way to Feng Ye, who is clearly in bad shape. Feng Ye is coughing up blood and struggling to stay upright. Ah Fei hands him some meds, his own face twisted in concern. Meanwhile, Huo Jiao assists number 2, helping her regain her strength and composure. Back on the battlefield, the leader of the Daybreak Guild unleashes his ultimate move, the Daybreak Slash. The powerful attack slices through the air, hitting the king with immense force and sending him flying backward. The impact shakes the ground, leaving even the king momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Lu Li appears behind the king with lightning speed. He moves with deadly precision, his sword striking deep into the king's back. Blood sprays from the wound as Lu Li's attack lands perfectly, his timing impeccable. The king roars in pain, his voice echoing across the battlefield. Slowly, he turns to face Lu Li, his devil eye glowing ominously. His gaze is filled with fury as he tells Lu Li that his patience has finally reached its limit. The king's aura grows darker, his presence more menacing than ever. Before the king can retaliate, all the members of the Daybreak Guild and Lu Li's team close in around him. The king is now surrounded on all sides with every warrior ready to strike. Each one prepares their attack, their combined strength creating an overwhelming sense of power. The final assault is about to begin, and the king, though still standing, is now truly cornered. I hope you liked today's video, and if you did, hit that like button as today's like goal is 1,500 likes. Comment next part down below for the next part. Also, consider subscribing with the notification bell on to get notified as soon as a new video drops onto the channel. You can also join the channel to support me financially and watch videos before public release. I'll meet you in the next video. Until then, thanks for watching.